Every Sunday evening, I tied the same faded apron around my waist and cooked dinner for my only son. The house looked peaceful from the street, but inside, I had begun to feel like a guest in my own life. That night, I prepared roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and an apple pie from scratch. I had made meals like that for Mark since he was a little boy who could barely see over the table. But when Mark arrived with Vanessa, he barely looked at the meal and barely looked at me. Vanessa walked in wearing expensive perfume and a smile that never reached her eyes. She looked at my old furniture as though everything I loved was an embarrassment. I smiled politely, because I had learned that silence often reveals more than argument. During dinner, Mark kept checking his phone while Vanessa complained about my outdated house. Then Mark placed a leather folder on the table, and the warmth left the room. I already knew that whatever was inside that folder was not meant to protect me. He said Vanessa and he had been talking about my future. Vanessa called it responsible planning, but her eyes kept drifting toward the deed to my house. The papers would have given Mark control over my home, my accounts, and decisions I was still capable of making myself. I asked for time to understand what I was signing. That was when my son's patience disappeared. Vanessa did not defend me. She only watched to see how far he would go. Mark stood so quickly that his chair scraped across the floor like a warning. He stepped toward me and took the folder from my hands. His push was not strong enough to leave a bruise, but it was strong enough to show me what he believed. Then he said the words I would never forget. "For God's sake, Mom, you're just a housewife." The room went so silent that I could hear the clock above the stove. I looked down at my apron, then back at the son who thought it made me small. He told me to sign the papers and stop making things difficult. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply asked them to leave. Mark laughed and told me I would regret it. When the door closed behind them, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by the meal nobody had respected. He thought I was just a housewife. He did not know I owned the company that paid his salary. The next morning, I opened the drawer where I kept the reports Mark never knew existed. For 6 months, reports from Whitmore Holdings had arrived quietly at my home. Whitmore Holdings was the company my late husband and I had built before Mark was old enough to understand sacrifice. Thomas and I built that business at this same kitchen table, long before there were offices or executives. He never wanted wealth to turn our family into strangers. So after he died, I kept my ownership private and let the world think I was only a widow in an apron. But the reports about Mark had become impossible to ignore. There were inflated invoices, personal luxury expenses, and vendor payments that made no sense. There were also complaints from older employees who said Mark pressured them to resign. Even then, part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation. A mother can read evidence and still see the little boy she once protected. But after that Sunday dinner, I stopped protecting him from the truth. I called Richard Coleman, my husband's lawyer and closest advisor. When I told him what had happened, he did not interrupt me once. Then he reviewed the documents Mark had tried to make me sign. The papers were worse than I expected. They would have given Mark power over my property, finances, and medical decisions. Vanessa's name appeared in places where it had no reason to be. Richard looked at me and said we needed to act carefully. Careful had always been my way. Now careful would become my weapon. 2 days later, I went to Whitmore Holdings for a private meeting. Andrew Blake, the CEO, stood when I entered. He placed a thick report in front of me and asked if I was ready to see everything. I told him I had spent my life facing hard truths quietly. The evidence was detailed, organized, and devastating. Andrew said there was enough for termination and possibly an outside investigation. Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. Mark had not only betrayed the company. He had betrayed the foundation his father helped build. Andrew asked what I wanted the company to do. I told him to invite Mark to Monday's executive meeting. On Monday morning, I wore a navy blue suit I had not touched in years. It was not armor, but it reminded me that I had been more than what my son chose to see. I locked the house behind me and drove to the company that carried my husband's name. At the lobby, the receptionist straightened the moment she saw me. The people who knew the truth greeted me with the respect Mark never offered. I passed photographs of the company in its early days and remembered the nights Thomas and I worked until sunrise. By 9 o'clock, the boardroom was ready. I sat at the head of the table and placed my hands calmly in front of me. Richard sat to my right. Andrew sat to my left. Then Mark walked in as if the room belonged to him. Vanessa followed behind him, carrying the same polished confidence she had worn in my kitchen. Then he saw me. Vanessa stopped so abruptly that her handbag slipped from her shoulder. Mark tried to laugh, but no one in the room joined him. He asked what I was doing there, and I told him I was waiting for him. Richard placed my ownership documents on the table. As Mark read the first page, the arrogance left his face. For the first time, he understood that the woman he dismissed had always been the majority owner. I reminded him of what he had called me in my kitchen. He said it had been a private family argument. I told him it was the moment he showed me who he had become. Andrew began reading from the investigation report. Unauthorized transfers were listed first. Then came inflated invoices and luxury expenses charged to company accounts. Then came statements from employees who had been bullied into silence. With each page, Mark's confidence cracked a little more. Vanessa whispered his name, but he snapped at her to be quiet. That was when I realized Vanessa may not have known everything, but she had known enough. Then Richard opened the folder Mark had brought to my house. The board members read the papers in silence, and their disgust needed no words. Mark said he had only been trying to help me. I told him the truth, he had not tried to help me. He had tried to erase me. For once, my son had no clever answer. Vanessa looked from him to me as though the life she had planned was collapsing in real time. I stood, even though my knees felt weaker than my voice sounded. I told Mark he was terminated from Whitmore Holdings, effective immediately. His corporate cards, executive access, and company apartment would be revoked. Andrew informed him that the evidence would be handed to outside investigators. Mark looked at me as if I had betrayed him by refusing to let him betray me further. Then he called me Mom for the first time that day. I wanted to answer like a mother. I had to answer like a woman protecting herself. I told him he did not get to use that word only when he needed mercy. Security escorted him out quietly, and Vanessa followed behind him in tears. At the door, he said I had ruined his life. I told him I had only stopped letting him ruin mine. When the door closed, the room felt heavier than any victory should feel. Justice can protect you and still break your heart. That evening, I returned to the same house Mark had tried to take from me. The kitchen was quiet, but for the first time in months, it did not feel lonely. 3 months later, I baked an apple pie for myself. The smell filled the house, not as a duty, but as a choice. Richard helped me update my will and protect the home Thomas and I built. Part of my estate would support programs that protect older parents from financial abuse. At the company, employees who had feared Mark finally began to speak freely. I also began helping other seniors recognize manipulation before it became a cage. I learned that many people suffer in silence because betrayal by family feels too shameful to name. Every morning, I made tea for myself and remembered that peace can be rebuilt. One evening, I took off my apron, folded it, and placed it on the chair. I looked at my reflection and saw not weakness, but endurance. I was never just a housewife. I was the woman who held everything together.